I'm Jess, part-time hobbit, and I'm here to talk to you about Tolkien. 'Tis officially the season, spooky season, and today we are going to get spooky with a little Tolkien story time. I did this kind of video one other time before with Farmer Giles of Ham, so if you want to check that out, that video was a ton of fun. But basically what we are going to do today is sit down and read through, in this case, a couple of Tolkien stories, and I'm gonna read some passages and just summarize others and inject my own thoughts, and we are just gonna sit and relax and have a fun, spooky time tonight. So settle down with your goblet of hot chocolate and your seasonally appropriate candles, and let's tell some stories. So here's the thing, Tolkien doesn't really have any, expressly scary stories. He never really wrote any horror stories, but there definitely are some elements of horror and suspense in his writing. So instead of reading one specific story today, we are going to look at the 3 spookiest snippets from his Lord of the Rings trilogy and talk about those. So I don't think there really could be a better possible place to start than with a very traditional ghost story. Ghost stories kind of had a renaissance of sorts in the Victorian era, especially with groundbreaking stories like A Christmas Carol. And because Tolkien grew up kind of in the aftermath of the Victorian era, he definitely would have been super familiar with those kinds of stories. And one of the first times in the trilogy that we get to see Tolkien kind of make use of these horror tropes and the suspense that he writes so well is in the Barrow Downs scene. So this is from the Fellowship of the Ring, and the chapter is Fog on the Barrow Downs. I'm kind of starting midway through the chapter, but if you need context, Frodo has just left the Shire with Sam, Merry, and Pippin, and they have just left the house of Tom Bombadil, and they are on the road again. So we are just gonna pick up right there. Their way wound along the floor of the hollow, and round the green feet of a steep hill into another deeper and broader valley, and then over the shoulder of further hills, and down into their long limbs and up their smooth sides again, up onto new hilltops and down into new valleys. There was no tree nor any visible water. It was a country of grass and short, springy turf, silent except for the whisper of the air over the edges of the land and high, lonely cries of strange birds. So he describes the day as growing hotter and hotter as they travel. A shadow now lay round the edge of the sight, a dark haze above which the upper sky was like a blue cap, hot and heavy. About midday they came upon a hill, whose top was wide and flattened like a shallow saucer with a green mounded rim. Inside there was no air stirring, and the sky seemed near their heads. They rode across and looked northwards. I really love how Tolkien begins this scene on kind of a very bright day. It's very hot, the sun is bright, there's no leaf cover, it's not a creepy forest or any of those traditional tropes. He manages to make it eerie just with the stillness and silentness of the air. So they think they see the road in the distance, and they are very excited because they think that they're going to be able to leave the Barrow Downs before nightfall. And despite what seems to be their better judgment, they decide to go down into this hollow on the top of the hill. In the midst of it, there stood a single stone, standing tall under the sun above, and at this hour casting no shadow. It was shapeless and yet significant, like a landmark or a guiding finger, or more like a warning. Of course, they do not heed this warning, and instead decide to stop for lunch, because, hobbits. I love how Tolkien makes use of standing stones because they're all over England from what I remember, albeit it's been, 12, 15 years since I've been there. But growing up there and traveling around the countryside, I always just remember seeing these standing stones, and oftentimes people had no idea why they were there, but they had always been there. And there's something so eerie about that, how these things connect us to our past, but we don't know how, and we don't know why they were there. Of course, don't cite me on that, because we may know why they were put there. I just personally don't know, so I assume everybody else doesn't know. So after their long and weary day of riding, and after their lunch, They all sort of fall asleep. However that may be, they woke suddenly and uncomfortably from a sleep they had never meant to take. The standing stone was cold, and it cast a long, pale shadow that stretched eastward over them. The sun, a pale and watery yellow, was gleaming through the mist just above the west wall of the hollow in which they lay. North, south, and east, beyond the wall, the fog was thick, cold, and white. The air was silent and heavy and chill. Now Tolkien has broken away from this sunny day and is kind of diving deeper into the traditions of the ghost story. So despite the fog, they take hope in the fact that they had seen the road earlier that day and forge off into the fog in the direction they thought they were supposed to go. In order to avoid being separated, as they march through this blinding fog, they decide to walk in a single file line so that they can all see the hobbit in front of them. Frodo is leading, and he thinks he sees a gap in the hill, and he calls back. "Come on, follow me," he called back over his shoulder, and he hurried forward. But his hope soon changed to bewilderment and alarm. The dark patches grew darker, but they shrank, and suddenly he saw, towering ominous before him and leaning slightly towards one another, like pillars of a headless door, 2 standing stones. He could not remember having seen any sign of these in the valley when he looked out from the hill in the morning. He had passed between them almost before he was aware, and even as he did so, darkness seemed to fall around him. His pony reared and snorted, and he fell off. When he looked back, he found that he was alone. The others had not followed him. And the idea of these 2 standing stones as a door into a netherworld of sorts, it goes way back into Irish, fairy, and folklore, and it's very cool inclusion. So Frodo panics and his pony bolts, and he's calling after his friends, "Sam! Sam! Merry! Pippin!" From some way off, or so it seemed, he thought he heard a cry. "Hoy, Frodo! Hoy!" It was away eastward on his left as he stood under the great stones, staring and straining against the gloom. He plunged off in the direction of the call and soon found himself going steeply uphill. As he struggled on, he called again and kept calling more and more frantically, but he heard no answer for some time, and then it seemed faint, and far ahead and high above him. "Frodo! Hoy!" came the thin voices out of the mist, and then a cry that sounded like "Help! Help!" often repeated, ending with a last "Help!" that trailed off into a long wail suddenly cut short. He stumbled forward with all the speed he could towards the cries, but the light was now gone, and clinging night had closed around him so that it was impossible to be sure of any direction. He was weary, sweating, and yet chilled. It was wholly dark. "Where are you? Where are you?" he cried out miserably. There was no reply. So he finds that he was traveling in the wrong direction, and all of a sudden there is a wind flowing. The mist was flowing past him now in shreds and tatters. His breath was smoking, and the darkness was less near and thick. "Where are you?" he cried again, both angry and afraid. "Here," said a voice, deep and cold, that seemed to come out of the ground. "I am waiting for you." "No," said Frodo, but he did not run away. His knees gave, and he fell on the ground. Nothing happened, and there was no sound. Trembling, he looked up in time to see a dark figure like a shadow against the stars. It leaned over him. He thought there were 2 eyes, very cold, though lit with a pale light that seemed to come from some remote distance. Then a grip stronger and colder than iron seized him. The icy touch froze his bones, and he remembered no more. When he came to himself again, for a moment he could recall nothing except a sense of dread. Then suddenly he knew that he was imprisoned, caught hopelessly. He was in a barrow. A barrow, for context, is an ancient burial mound, so this is just horrifying. A barrow-wight had taken him, and he was probably already under the dreadful spells of the barrow-wights about which the tale spoke. He dared not move, but lay as he found himself, flat upon his back upon a cold stone, with his hands upon his breast. And so he battles with himself and tries to sum up some of the courage of Bilbo Baggins. As he lay there thinking and getting a hold of himself, he He noticed all at once that the darkness was slowly giving way. A pale, greenish light was growing around him. It did not at first show him what kind of place he was in, for the light seemed to be coming out of himself and from the floor beside him, and had not yet reached the roof or the wall. He turned, and there in the cold glow he saw beside him Sam, Pippin, and Merry. They were on their backs, and their faces looked deathly pale, and they were clad in white. About them lay many treasures, of gold, maybe, though in that light they looked cold and unlovely. On their heads were circlets. Gold chains were about their wrists, and on their fingers were many rings. Swords lay by their sides, and shields were at their feet. But across their 3 necks lay one long, naked sword. Suddenly a song began, a cold murmur rising and falling. The voice seemed far away, and immeasurably dreary, sometimes high in the air and thin, sometimes like a low moan from the ground. Out of the formless stream of sad but horrible sounds, strings of words would now and again shape themselves. Grim, hard, cold words, heartless and miserable. The night was railing against the morning of which it was bereaved, and the cold was cursing the warmth for which it hungered. Frodo was chilled to the marrow. After a while, the song became clearer, and with dread in his heart, he perceived that it had changed into an incantation. Cold be hand and heart and bone, and cold be sleep under stone. Never more to wake on stony bed. Never till the sun fails and the moon is dead. In the black wind the stars shall die, and still on gold here let them lie, till the dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land. He heard behind his head a creaking and scraping sound. Raising himself on one arm, he looked, and saw now in the pale light that they were in a kind of passage, which behind them turned a corner. Round the corner, a long arm was groping, walking on its fingers towards Sam, who was lying nearest, and towards the hilt of the sword that lay upon him. At first Frodo felt as if he indeed had been turned into stone by the incantation. Then a wild thought of escape came to him. He thought of himself running free over the grass, grieving for Merry, Sam, and Pippin, but free and alive himself. Gandalf would admit that there was nothing else he could do, but the courage that had been awakened in him was now too strong. He could not leave his friends so easily. He wavered, groping in his pocket, and then fought with himself again, and as he did so, the arm crept nearer. Suddenly resolve hardened in him, and he seized a short sword that lay beside him, and kneeling, he stooped low over the bodies of his companions. With what strength he had, he hewed at the crawling arm near the wrist, and the hand broke off. But at that same moment, the sword splintered up to the hilt. There was a shriek, and the light vanished. In the darkness, there was a snarling noise. At that point, luckily, Frodo has Tom Bombadil to sweep in and save the day for him. But that is just such a delightfully creepy turn of the story, and especially having this happen, relatively early in the Fellowship. It really helps kind of break us out of this cozy, warm lull of the Shire and of Tom Bombadil's house, and reminds us that Middle-earth is a scary, scary, and unknown place. I also adore how he plays with the tropes of the ghost story. You have the day that kind of disappears into night, and the deep fog that comes up, and then the standing stones acting as a doorway into this frightening netherworld. And then having this take place in the Barrows, these ancient graves of hundreds-year-old dead kings where they have just been decaying away and rotting on their icy cold piles of gold and wealth. And the idea of ending up there, not quite dead, but certainly not alive, just sleeping there forever in the shadows until the end of time. It is such chilling imagery, not to mention the actual arm that starts crawling towards them. That's just horrifying. I do kind of wish that this scene had made it into Peter Jackson's trilogy, because knowing Peter Jackson's film history, I think he would have done something super fun with the barrow-wights, but you know, you can't win them all. So with our ghost story out of the way, let's move into what I'll call like Tolkien's take on cosmic horror. Now, the idea of cosmic horror was kind of created and pioneered by H.P. Lovecraft. If you don't know H.P. Lovecraft, you've probably heard of Cthulhu at some point. Listen, Lovecraft is not my thing, but I do find his concepts to be very fascinating, if not a little bit too horrifying for me. And Tolkien was known to have read some of what we would call cosmic horror, although the only written evidence we have of him reading specifically H.P. Lovecraft, he was not a fan of it, but considering how kind of nihilistic and negative Lovecraft's works tend to be compared to Tolkien's, I would say more positive take on life and the world, that is a bit unsurprising. But still, we can see these themes kind of being carried over into his writing, particularly in the scene with the Balrog. Before I get into this, I think it's important to talk about the basic ideas of cosmic horror, because I haven't actually explained it at all. I'm far from an expert, but my take on it is that it is horror that plays on our fear of something greater than us and beyond our comprehension. So oftentimes it will be these kind of gods of a different world, or these gods that are able to break reality with their power, and their power and their existence is so unimaginably vast that it just breaks our minds, because compared to them, we are merely ants, which is something that our human minds are not capable of absorbing and taking in. And so these people that interact with Lovecraftian monsters are often scholars, and they are usually sent spiraling into madness by the things that they discover. Of course, there are kind of echoes of this in the Watcher in the Lake outside of Moria, but then once we get into Moria, we get to see the Balrog. So this is once the Fellowship has been in Moria for some time, and they are within the tomb of Balin. They find a logbook that the dwarven colony that was going to reclaim Moria had been keeping of their adventure, and Gandalf begins reading it. Gandalf says, "The first clear word is sorrow, but the rest of the line is lost. Balin, Lord of Moria, fell in Dimril Dale. He went alone to look in Miramir. An orc shot him from behind a stone. The remainder of the page is so blurred that I can hardly make anything out, but I think I can read, we have barred the gates, and then can hold them long if, and then perhaps, horrible and suffer. Poor Balin. He seems to have kept the title he took for less than 5 years. I wonder what happened afterwards, but there is no time to puzzle out the last few pages. Here is the last page of all. It is a grim reading," he said. "I fear their end was cruel. Listen, we cannot get out. We cannot get out. They have taken the bridge and the second hall. Far and Loni and Nali fell there. Then there are 4 lines smeared, so I can only read, went 5 days ago. The last lines run, the pool is up to the wall at Westgate. The Watcher in the water took Oin. We cannot get out. The end comes, and then drums. Drums in the deep." I wonder what that means. The last thing written is a trailing scrawl of elf letters. They are coming. There is nothing more. Gandalf paused and stood in silent thought. So Gandalf decides it's time for them to leave, but just as they are leaving, there came a great noise, a rolling boom that seemed to come from the depths far below and to tremble in the stone at their feet. They sprang towards the door in alarm. Doom, doom, it rolled again, as if huge hands were turning the very caverns of Moria into a vast drum. Then there came an echoing blast. A great horn was blown in the hall, and answering horns and harsh cries were heard further off. There was a hurrying sound of many feet. "They are coming!" cried Legolas. "We cannot get out," said Gimli. "Trapped!" cried Gandalf. Why did I delay? Here we are, caught just as they were before. But I was not here then. We will see what. Doom, doom, came the drum beat and the walls shook. Slam the doors and wedge them, shouted Aragorn, and keep your packs on as long as you can. We may get a chance to cut our way out yet. No, said Gandalf, we must not get shut in. Keep the east door ajar. We will go that way if we get the chance. Another harsh horn call and the shrill cries rang out. Feet were coming down the corridor. There was a ring and clatter as the company drew their swords. Glamdring shone with a pale light, and Sting glinted at the edges. Boromir set his shoulder against the western door. Wait a moment! Do not close it yet, said Gandalf. He sprung towards Boromir's side and drew himself up to his full height. Who comes hither to disturb the rest of Balin, Lord of Moria? He cried out in a loud voice. There was a rush of hoarse laughter, like the fall of sliding stones into a pit. Amid the clamor, a deep voice was raised in command. Doom, boom, doom, went the drums in the deep. So I am going to cut that delightful story off there, just because I will end up reading the whole chapter if I'm not careful, and that kind of got the eeriest part out of the way for me. So here Tolkien makes use of something that I believe is called an apocalypse log, if I'm not mistaken. And it's this idea of a log or a recording that someone makes before the end, before an apocalyptic event occurs to them. My nerd is definitely showing here, but one of my favorite examples of this is in the Firefly spin-off movie Serenity, when they find a recording of a researcher who, I guess spoiler alert for Serenity if you didn't see it in the 10 years it's been out. Basically, the science experiment has gone terribly wrong, and they are about to be cannibalized by the horrifyingly violent creatures that they have created. And in this recording that she has created, she is desperately explaining what she has done wrong. And as she's explaining this, we are hearing the pounding on the door outside as these creatures tear their way in, and then the recording shuts off just as they take her. And Tolkien just does such an excellent job of creating his apocalypse log here, especially with the way he makes use of the repetition of "we cannot get out." The end comes and then drums in the deep. It's so chilling, and then when you hear the characters repeat this later, oof, it is absolutely horrifying the way he builds the tension up in this scene, because you think that you're just reading a book, you know, something bad that has happened to people in the past, but that can't happen to you. And then you slowly see the signs that the exact same thing is about to happen to you. And no one else made it out except this apocalypse log. Of course, I talked all about that cosmic horror and then didn't even really get into the cosmically horrifying things that he creates in the Balrog, but we'll still discuss it because I think if you're here, you probably know what a Balrog is. But he does really take advantage of this idea of the dwarves delving too deep and too greedily and waking something up that they are utterly helpless to control. And even within the context of the story, the way our protagonists are faced by it, even Gandalf, who is clearly shown to be the wisest and oldest of the party, he is completely powerless against this thing, and it kills him. Of course, as we all know, Gandalf doesn't stay dead for too long, luckily, and that kind of goes into Tolkien's lack of pessimism compared to a lot of other horror writers. He had a strong base in his Catholic faith, and in the Catholic faith, everything effectively turns out alright in the end, so I would be kind of surprised if he wrote a kind of cosmic, overwhelming horror like the Balrog and then allowed it to win. But the other cosmic horror that we see him write isn't so clearly defeated, so let's get into that. Our final spooky outtake is from the Two Towers, and it is the chapter Shelob's Lair. Now, for context, Frodo and Sam have been traveling into Mordor to dispose of the ring, being guided by Gollum, and Gollum has presented another way to get into Mordor other than the front gate, and that is through these back caves. And Gollum has been here before, and Frodo and Sam have not. They're at the entrance of the cave, and they are not liking the horrifying way that it is smelling. Sam sniffed in the air. Ugh, That smell, he said. It's getting stronger and stronger. Presently, they were under the shadow, and there in the midst of it they saw the opening of a cave. This is the way in, said Gollum softly. This is the entrance to the tunnel. He did not speak its name, Torek Ungol, Shelob's lair. Out of it came a stench, not the sickly odor of decay in the meads of Morgul, but a foul reek, as if filth unnameable were piled and hoarded in the dark within. Is this the only way, Smeagol? Said Frodo. Yes, yes, he answered. Yes, we must go this way now. Do you mean to say you've been through this hole? Said Sam. Phew, but perhaps you don't mind the bad smells. Gollum's eyes glinted. He doesn't know what we mind, does he, precious? No, he doesn't. But Smeagol can bear things, yes. He's been through, oh yes, right through. It's the only way. And what makes the smell, I wonder, said Sam. It's like, well, I wouldn't like to say, some beastly hole of the orcs, I'll warrant, and with 100 years of their filth in it. Well, said Frodo, orcs or no, if it's the only way, we must take it. Drawing a deep breath, they passed inside. In a few steps, they were in utter and impenetrable dark. Not since the lightless passages of Moria had Frodo or Sam known such darkness, and if possible here, it was deeper and denser. There were airs moving, and echoes and a sense of space. Here, the air was still, stagnant, heavy, and sound fell dead. They walked as it were in a black vapor, wrought of veritable darkness itself. As it was breathed, brought blindness not only to the eyes but to the mind, so that even the memory of colors and forms and of any light faded out of thought. Night always had been, and always would be, and night was all. So they're being led by Gollum, who they can't really see, but Sam notices that there are offshoots to the tunnel. There are multiple caverns. After that, first he on the right and then Frodo on the left, past 3 or 4 such openings, some wider, some smaller, but there was as yet no doubt of the main way, for it was straight and did not turn, and went steadily up. But how long was it? And how much more of this would they have to endure, or could they endure? The breathlessness of the air was growing as they climbed, and now they seemed often, in the blind dark, to sense some resistance, thicker than the foul air. As they thrust forward, they felt things brush against their heads or against their hands, long tentacles or hanging growths perhaps, but they could not tell what they were. And still, the stench grew. It grew until almost it seemed to them that the smell was the only clear sense left to them, and that was for their torment. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, how many had they passed in this lightless hole? Hours? Days? Weeks, rather. Sam left the tunnel side and shrank towards Frodo, and their hands met and clasped, and so together they still went on. It is at this point, caged in by the darkness, being touched by unknown things and thinking that they know the way, that Frodo and Sam begin to panic. The path is no longer clear, and they run through the shadows, clutching onto each other, wishing that at least they had Gollum for company, but there is no company. Sam reminds Frodo of the Phial of Galadriel that he has with him, which is supposed to be able to emit holy light. Aya Erendil Elenion an Kalima, he cried, and knew not what he had spoken, for it seemed that another voice spoke through his, clear and untroubled by the foul air of the pit. But other potencies there are in Middle-earth, powers of night, and they are old and strong. And she that walked in the darkness had heard the elves cry that cry far back in the deeps of time, and she had not heeded it, and it did not daunt her now. Even as Frodo spoke, He felt a great malice bent upon him, and a deadly regard considering him. Not far down the tunnel, between them and the opening where they had reeled and stumbled, he was aware of eyes growing visible. 2 great clusters of many-windowed eyes. The coming menace was unmasked at last. The radiance of the star glass was broken and thrown back from their 1,000 facets, but behind the glitter, a pale, deadly fire began steadily to glow within, a flame kindled in some deep pit of evil thought. Monstrous and abominable eyes they were, bestial and yet filled with purpose and with hideous delight, gloating over their prey, trapped beyond all hope of escape. But Frodo stands as the eyes creep nearer. "Galadriel," he called, and gathering his courage he lifted up the phial once more. The eyes halted. For a moment their regard relaxed, as if some hint of doubt troubled them. Then holding the star aloft and the bright sword, advanced Frodo, Hobbit of the Shire, walked steadily down to meet the eyes. And they wavered. Doubt came into them as the light approached. One by one they dimmed, and slowly they drew back. No brightness so deadly had ever afflicted them before. From sun and moon and star they had been safe underground, but now a star had descended into the very earth. Still it approached, and the eyes began to quail. One by one they all went dark. They turned away, and a great bulk beyond the light's reach heaved its huge shadow in between. They were gone. Sam and Frodo proceed with some caution, and they begin to see the walls are covered in spider webs. They think they've cut their way free, but then Tolkien launches us into a description of Shelob. There, age-long had she dwelt, an evil thing in spider form, even such as once of old had lived in the land of elves in the west, that is now under the sea. How Shelob came there, flying from ruin, no tale tells, for out of the dark years few tales have come. But still, she was there, who was there before Sauron and before the first stone of Barad-dûr, and she had served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men, bloated and grown fat, with endless brooding on her feasts, weaving webs of shadow, for all living things were her food, and her vomit darkness. Far and wide her lesser broods, bastards of the miserable mates, her own offspring that she slew, spread from glen to glen, from the Ephel Duath to the eastern hills, to Dol Guldur and the fastness of Mirkwood. But none could rival her, Shelob the Great, the last child of Ungoliant to trouble the unhappy world. Already years before, Gollum had beheld her, Smeagol, who pried into all dark holes, and in past days he had bowed and worshipped her, and the darkness of her evil will walked through all the ways of his weariness beside him, cutting off from light and from regret, and he had promised to bring her food. But her lust was not his lust. Little she knew of or cared for towers or rings or anything devised by mind or hand, who only desired death for all others, mind and body, and for herself a glut of life, alone, swollen till the mountains could no longer hold her up, and the darkness could not contain her. But that desire was yet far away, and long now had she been hungry, lurking in her den, while the powers of Sauron grew, and light and living things forsook his borders. And the city in the valley was dead, and no elf or man came near, only unhappy orcs, poor food and wary. Hardly had Sam hidden the light of the star glass when she came. A little way ahead and to his left he saw suddenly, issuing from a black hole of shadow underneath the cliff, the most loathly shape he had ever beheld, horrible beyond horror of an evil dream. More like a spider she was, but huger than the great hunting beasts, and more terrible than they because of the evil purpose behind her remorseless eyes. Great horns she had, and behind her short, stalk-like neck was her huge, swollen body, a vast, bloated bag swaying and sagging between her legs. Its great bulk was black, blotched with livid marks, but the belly underneath was pale and luminous, and gave forth a stench. Her legs were bent, with great knobbled joints high above her back, and hairs that stuck out like steel spines, and at each leg's end there was a claw. As soon as she had squeezed her soft, squelching body and its folded limbs out of the upper exit from her lair, she moved with a horrible speed, now running on her creaking legs, now making a sudden bound. She was between Sam and his master. Either she did not see Sam, or she avoided him for the moment as the bearer of the light, and fixed all her intent upon one prey, upon Frodo. Bereft of his phial, running heedless upon the path, yet unaware of his peril. Swiftly he ran, but Shelob was swifter. In a few great leaps, she would have him. But before Sam can call out a warning to Frodo, Gollum strikes, who is hiding and biding his time. Sam flies into a rage and beats Gollum, but before he could overtake him, Gollum was gone. Then, as the dark hole stood before him, and the stench came out to meet him like a clap of thunder, the thought of Frodo and the monster smote upon Sam's mind. He spun round and rushed wildly up the path, calling and calling his master's name. He was too late. So far, Gollum's plan had succeeded. Frodo was lying face upward on the ground, and the monster was bending over him, so intent upon her victim that she took no heed of Sam and his cries until he was close at hand. As he rushed up, he saw that Frodo was already bound in cords wound about him from ankle to shoulder, and the monster, with her great forelegs, was beginning to half lift, half to drag his body away. So Sam takes up Frodo's sword and summons all the courage he has left, and he attacks Shelob. It's a close battle, but at the last moment, Sam calls out an elven chant that he remembers. "Now come, you filth," he cried. "You've hurt my master, you brute, and you'll pay for it. We're going on, but we'll settle with you first. Come on and taste it again." As if his indomitable spirit had set its potency in motion, the glass phial blazed suddenly like a white torch in his hand. It flamed like a star that, leaping from the firmament, sears the dark air with intolerable light. No such terror out of heaven had ever burned Shelob's face before. The beams of it entered into her wounded head and scored it with an unbearable pain, and the dreadful infection of light spread from eye to eye. She fell back, beating the air with her forelegs, her sight blasted by inner lightnings, her mind in agony. Then, turning her maimed head away, she rolled aside and began to crawl, claw by claw, towards the opening of the dark cliff behind. Sam came on. He was reeling like a drunken man, but he came on, and Shelob cowed at last, shrunken in defeat, jerked and quivered as she tried to hasten from him. She reached the hole, and squeezing down, leaving a trail of green-yellow slime, she slipped in, even as Sam hewed a last stroke at her dragging legs. Then he fell to the ground. Shelob was gone, and whether she lay long in her lair, nursing her malice and her misery and slow years of darkness, healed herself from within, rebuilding her clustered eyes until, with hunger like death, she spun once more her dreadful snares into the glens of the mountains of shadow, this tale does not tell. What a perfect ending to Shelob's character, because obviously Tolkien says that this tale doesn't tell, but he spells out a pretty vivid story for what she is going to do if she survives, which leads me to believe that Shelob does survive this and continues to be a nuisance for years to come. I think Shelob is probably the best encapsulation of Tolkien's fascination with this kind of primal cosmic horror that we wouldn't necessarily expect from him. And I think one of the scariest things about Shelob is just how how unknown she is. All we really know of her is that she is a descendant of Ungoliant. Ungoliant's origins are kind of even less known than Shelob's. Ungoliant and thus also Shelob are described less as like creations and more as like natural results of the darkness within the world. If you are to have goodness, then naturally there must be evil as an option. And if you are to have light and fullness, you will have darkness and you will have hunger. Ungoliant and Shelob are these kind of natural vacuums. They are just hunger and lust incarnate. And for that, they are truly remarkable characters. There is so much like physical body horror. And then you also have this overbearing stench so strong that it becomes like a physical force at point, which is also something that Lovecraft made use of a lot, which is kind of interesting how these themes carry over, where such a visceral thing as a stench and just how utterly disgusting she is. And yeah, that was our last story of the day. Of course, there are other scary things that Tolkien writes. These are just the three that I thought of, and the three that I thought it would be fun to talk about this particular Halloween. But please do let me know what your other favorite scary Tolkien stories are, because I am in the mood to read something spooky. Also, if you are wearing a Tolkien-themed costume for Halloween this year, you have to let me know. It's kind of a rule of the channel, so also make sure you drop a comment on what you're dressing as this year. I'm not doing anything for Halloween since it's like a Monday, but I was thinking of doing a casual Baruthiel cosplay. Shout out to anyone who knows who she is. And then I can try and get the rats to wear tiny cat ears so that I can be Baruthiel and they can be Baruthiel's cats. I don't think it's a costume anyone will get, but it'll make me happy. I had a lot of fun making this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. And if you did enjoy it, make sure you give this video a like. And if you like what I'm doing over here on this channel, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss a single one of my videos. I am, as always, eternally grateful that you came to join me this week, and I hope that you all have a very happy, hobbity, spooky day.